In this video, I'm going to take a crusty old Atari ST and get it working just like in the old days. In the late 80s, I purchased an Atari 1040STF. I used that computer for about 4 or 5 years and I absolutely loved it. Unfortunately, I gave the computer away at the time and I kind of always regretted that decision. Recently, I was able to find a couple of unused, untested, crusty old Atari STs on eBay, so I thought it might be kind of fun to take a chance on them, see if I could get them working just like in the old days. So I wanted to make this video, show you how I did that, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks. The first unit that I found on eBay was being sold as is, untested, for parts repair only. Picked it up for $76 plus $33 shipping. Seller stated that he had power tested it and was able to get a red light, but that was the extent of the testing, so we'll see what we get with it. Opening the box, the pictures were clear on this, that the one side's got some rust on it, so it's possible that it's come in contact with water at some point. That may or may not be a problem because it's unknown if it works, so we'll see what we get. Looking around the unit, it's in relatively good condition as far as its physical appearance. There's no cracks, dings, dents, modifications. There is definitely evidence of rust, as you can see here from the modem port. The printer and the hard disk show more of the same. The MIDI ports and the cartridge port look pretty decent on this side. And the mouse, yellowed, grimy, definitely seen some use, and split on the front end, but should be no big deal. Because the condition was unknown, I opted to go ahead and do an investigation before trying to power it up. The ST is relatively easy to undo. Take all the screws out of the bottom, about 10, and pop the top cover off. Next step is to lift the keyboard off, and there's a single cable connection for that, and set that aside. The next step is to remove the power supply cage, and there are 2 screws holding that down, and they're relatively easy to remove. There's some of these twist clips in here. I'll show you that in a minute, how to undo those. All of it's fairly straightforward and simple to do. Set that aside, remove the floppy drive cable cover, and now's a good time to go ahead and undo the rest of these twist clips. As you can see here, just twist them. I twisted them many times over the course of working on this and never had any issues with it. So there's about 4 screws along the front of the case here to get the main motherboard out, so take those out. Next step, undo the floppy drive cables and go ahead and set that aside. To get the top shielding off, you will need to remove the power supply at this point. A couple of screws, lift it on out. Use caution working with the power supply. Go ahead and take the top cover off at this point, the top shielding, and set it aside. It's got some signs of rust on it as well. And at this point, you've got the motherboard exposed. It sits on a bottom tray, and as you can see here, the case and the bottom of that tray is more evidence of the same, more rust and corrosion. Next, you'll want to get the motherboard removed off of that bottom tray. It's kind of pressed in there, but fairly easy to get separated. And looking at the bottom of the motherboard here, more of the same, rust, corrosion, but generally it's in pretty good condition. The tracing all looks good. There's no physical damage. I've got a little bit of hope that maybe this motherboard will work or we can salvage it. Looking at the bottom tray, removing the insulation there, just more of the same that'll need to be cleaned up. Taking a closer look at the chips, many of the chips on the ST are socketed, and as you can see here, there's quite a bit of corrosion and rust in those, and more of the same on the motherboard. That's generally what I was looking at having to deal with. So when I pulled the power supply out, there was some evidence of scorching and the board was discolored, so I wanted to kind of give it a once over to see if it was in working order. And there was also a bee stuck in here that needed to be cleaned up. It was no big deal, but thought I'd just show it to you. At this point, the system looks like it's in pretty good shape, so I'm going to give it a quick boot test and see if we get anything out of it. The first obstacle you're going to run into is getting the video signal from the Atari's monitor port to a modern VGA port. And the cable is relatively simple to make. The Atari outputs a pretty low refresh rate. that most monitors do not support. So that'll be a challenge. I'll leave a link in the description below of a list of monitors that will work for you. And initially I did attempt to create my own cable, but my soldering iron kind of sucks, and to be honest, my soldering skills are a little less than stellar, so I had a hard time getting this cable done in a lot of little tiny pins and solder connections. So I did the next best thing, and I went out and purchased a cable, and I went to Cool Novelties, and the cable's nicely done, includes the audio lead, so that should work nice for what I'm trying to do here. Using that resource, I was able to find this NEC AccuSync LCD 51V. Found it in a thrift shop for about $8, and brought it home, cleaned it up, tested it with a PC. It works fine. We'll see if the Atari ST will drive it. So at this point, I got the Atari back together. We'll give it a quick boot test, see what we get out of it, and that's about the extent of it. Just some garbage on the screen. I did hook up a second monitor, and I did get an out of range error message, so I'm confident that the monitor is working good and that the Atari is just outputting garbage to it. So at this point, we'll need to go ahead and pull it apart. The very first step on any of these projects, if it's not booting, is to go ahead and reseat all of the socketable chips, and in this case I'm going to have to do some considerable cleanup. There is a lot of rust and corrosion in there. So go ahead and get those pulled out. I went through each chip and had to go over each pin fairly carefully, and had to do a lot of scraping and cleaning, and had to clean some of the sockets themselves. Used a little bit of rubbing alcohol there, get that cleaned up, and spent several hours doing this in between each set, giving it a boot test. Here's a close-up of pulling the chip. I just used a standard chip puller. Kind of, you want to go firm but gently, and rock that out of there. You can bend those pins, so be very careful pulling them out. The PLC chips, they do make a special extractor tool for this. I did not have it, so I opted to go ahead and just use a small flat blade screwdriver. Want to use a lot of caution here that you don't mar up that motherboard underneath through here, and these pins are very delicate. They could be bent quite easily, but same with these. I had to pull them out and do a good cleanup. After a couple of hours, I was finally able to get a successful boot, mainly by just cleaning up the rust and reseating all the chips. And so at this point I went ahead and added the floppy drive, the keyboard, the mouse, just to see if everything was functional. I was able to verify that the keyboard, the mouse worked. The floppy drive was recognized. It did not appear to be spinning up to the motor or have power to the motor, so I'll have to come back to that at some point and take a look at it. But at this point I'm happy that the computer is booting. So I'm going to go ahead and do a complete teardown, and we'll get it cleaned up. At this point, go ahead and get the keyboard torn apart. About 28 screws removes that circuit board. You want to use caution with all the little parts here, the little cups that provide the feedback to the keys and the connection to the circuit board. Just make sure you keep all those together. Turning the keys off is relatively simple. They're just held captive by these small little plastic pieces. Again, the biggest challenge here is just not losing any parts, keeping them all together. And at this point I just went ahead and worked through it and got them all pulled off. In the next video I'll just show you real quick cleaning up the entire system. I experimented around with retro brighting the plastic. I hadn't ever done that before. I'll go into that a little bit of how I did that. I'll need to investigate that floppy drive, see if it's in working order, get that mouse repaired, and get it all back together. We'll see if it works, see if we can get anything running on it. And anyways, I hope you enjoyed that. Stay tuned for the next video. Thanks.